In my video on the Tokugawa shogunate, I briefly touched on the collapse of the government. I explained that Commodore Matthew Perry's opening of Japan opened the eyes of average Japanese people to the fact that their government wasn't able to protect them from foreign invasion. However, this is oversimplified and does not analyze the cracks within the Tokugawa state that led to its downfall. If you recall, Tokugawa society was split into different stations. At the bottom were the merchants, then the artisans, the farmers, and at the top were the feudal lords and the samurai. This hierarchy was meant to keep order in society, where everybody knew their place. But this hierarchy had one fatal flaw. The merchants at the bottom were the only ones that generated any wealth. The samurai received a fixed payment from the government, meaning they didn't actually generate any wealth. So as the years went on, the samurai became poorer and the merchants became richer. It came to the point that the daimyo took out debts from the merchants, meaning the hierarchy was being thrown out of balance. The hierarchy crumbled further when the feudal lords increased taxes on the farmers in order to raise money for themselves. This led to hardship among the agriculturalists, who led protests in the 1830s. These protests grew rapidly, with the number of demonstrators numbering to the tens of thousands. So before the arrival of the United States, the social hierarchy of the Tokugawa era was already being compromised. Another factor that contributed to the shogunate's downfall were the world events of the time. As stated in my earlier video, the government enforced a closed country policy, meaning foreigners were barred from entering the country and no Japanese were allowed to leave. There was one exception, however. A small collection of Dutch merchants were allowed to port on the island of Nagasaki. They arrived once a year and brought with them scientific updates and Western media. They were one of the only connections the Japanese had with the outside world. These merchants also brought with them news about what had happened to China. In short, the West had been eating away at China's influence for a long time. This culminated in the Opium Wars, where the West, primarily the British, had brought the shining cultural center of Asia to its knees. China's markets then became dominated by Western firms, and China's power in Eastern Asia was waning. So, before Perry brought his Iron Fleet to Edo Harbor, the Japanese were well aware of the consequences. Because of the West's growing imperial ambitions in Eastern Asia, the opening of Japan was, in hindsight, an inevitability. The British and the Dutch had already begun to knock on Japan's door, but it was the Americans who eventually flew the door off its hinges. Perry's purpose in Japan was, on paper, to ensure American whalers' safety in the Sea of Japan. To secure the United States' interests, he used fear tactics and gunboat diplomacy. The purpose of the big metal ships and marching his modern army through the streets of Edo was to send a clear message to the Japanese that the Americans were in charge. Perry came back a few years later, and he and the Japanese signed the controversial Treaty of Kanagawa. This treaty opened 2 ports in Edo, with later treaties opening a total of 7 ports to the United States. Several more were opened to the British, the French, the Dutch, and the Russians. Additionally, American diplomats were allowed to live on Japanese soil, officially ending the closed country policy for good. The part of these treaties that were the most abhorrent to the Japanese were the clauses that said Americans on Japanese soil were not subject to the laws of Japan, but to the laws of the United States, giving Americans special privileges in their own homeland. These treaties and the reactions to them threw the country into disarray. A state of emergency was declared in Edo, as many began to evacuate the city. Some began to stockpile weapons and ammunition in order to fight back against the United States when they came back. The most common reaction to Perry's arrival was distrust and resentment towards the shogunate. The government's legitimacy was anchored in protecting Japan from foreigners, which they had utterly failed at. More importantly, this treaty was signed without the consent of Emperor Kome, who had become very angry with the shogunate, putting the shogunate at odds with the emperor. It wasn't common for the emperor to get involved in politics like this, so this was a very big deal at the time. In Japanese culture, the emperor isn't just seen as a mere figurehead, he is seen as a god among men. So the shogunate was not only seen to be against the wishes of a human monarch, but against the wishes of a god. There were many solutions given to solve the problems facing Japan, the most common of which was nativism. This was a conservative and extremely nationalist ideology, which said that in order for Japan to survive against the Western powers, it needed to go back to the old ways of governance, expel all foreigners from the country, and place the emperor back in power. A common slogan for this movement was Sono Joi, or revere the heavenly sovereign and expel the foreign barbarians. The Emperor Kome sympathized with this sentiment, even ordering the expulsion of all foreigners from Japan in 1863. Even though this had no effect on government policy, many samurai and ronin rallied behind the emperor's cause. In particular, the clans of Choshu and Satsuma became increasingly violent towards foreigners. One such act of violence was the bombardment at Shimonoseki. As the emperor's deadline for the foreigners' expulsion neared, forces from the Choshu clan began to bombard merchant ships sailing around the Shimonoseki Strait. British ships fired back in retaliation, and the shogunate was required to pay reparations for the Choshu's actions. Another incident was the murder of British merchant Charles Lennox Richardson. He was cut down by a samurai for not getting out of the middle of a road during a procession for Shimatsu Hisamitsu, the regent of the Satsuma domain. His death is considered a result of the emperor's edict. Reparations were demanded from the British from Satsuma for Richardson's death, who refused. In an attempt to coerce Satsuma, the British sent a squadron of ships to sail into the port of Kagoshima. Satsuma decided to open fire in retaliation, but his forces couldn't stand up against the might of the Royal Navy. The compromises the shogunate made with the British in order to keep peace was seen as weak in the eyes of many, further weakening their legitimacy. However, there was another philosophy, one which would shape the direction of the Meiji Restoration the most. In the city of Hagi, within the Kagoshima prefecture, there's an old schoolhouse called the Shokasonjuku Academy. Within the walls of this building, the founding philosophy of the Meiji Restoration was born. A nobleman named Yoshida Shoin lived in the Choshu domain. One night, he rode out from his home in Choshu out to Perry's black ships, hoping to learn more about Western technology and ways of life. He stowed away on one of these American ships. For this, he was sent back to the shogunate, where he was promptly placed under house arrest. While under detainment, he started a school and taught his philosophy to his pupils. His pupils would later become some of the most influential figures within the Meiji Restoration, such as the future Prime Minister of Japan, Ito Hirobumi. While Yoshida Shoin never himself had a direct hand in the Meiji Restoration, his nurturing of the future builders of the modern state has left not only an impact on Japan, but on East Asia as a whole. After his death, he was regarded by his pupils as a spiritual leader in the upcoming revolution, which would come to shake Japanese society to its core. In 1867, the Choshu and Satsuma clans, who were historical enemies, made a secret alliance to topple the shogunate. Led by Saigo Takamori, remember this guy, he'll be important later, the Satsuma Choshu army marched towards Edo to take over the government, starting the Boshin War, or the Japanese Civil War. The army seized the imperial court in Kyoto, where the new 14-year-old Emperor Meiji then made a decree abolishing the position of shogun. The shogun, Tokugawa Yoshinbu, initially accepted this, hoping that his cooperation would leave the house of Tokugawa intact. But when the house of Tokugawa was eventually dismantled, Yoshinbu tried to seize back control of the country. Several battles ensued, in which the shogun's army was left to the mercy of the smaller, yet more modernized, imperial army. After a battle outside of the city of Edo, the shogunate surrendered to the imperial army on the 4th of July, 1868, and thus Japan was launched into a new age. The country began to modernize rapidly. A provisional government was established on June 11th with a Grand Council of State known as the Dajokan. The key samurai who were instrumental in the Meiji Restoration became oligarchs who advised the emperor on matters of policy or made policy in the name of the emperor. The capital was moved from the old city of Kyoto to Edo, its most populous city. The emperor would now reside in Edo, which would be renamed to Tokyo. But there was a large problem that arose with the modernization of the country, the samurai. In order for Japan to become a modern country, the old class system of the Tokugawa era had to be dismantled. For the next 9 years, the samurai class would slowly be erased from the country. First, the internal ranking of samurai was abolished in 1869 in favor of an upper and a lower group. Then, in 1872, all samurai in the lower group were reclassified as commoners. In 1873, their stipends from the government became taxable, and in 1874, those stipends were converted into bonds. Eventually, the samurai class would no longer receive stipends from the government, effectively abolishing the samurai class. All former samurai were expected to leave their station behind, don suits and ties, and join society as new, modern men. The majority of them went along with this, as the old samurai life forbade them from engaging in commerce, and was leading them and their families towards poverty. However, there was a faction of samurai who grew increasingly angry with each stripping down of their ancient title. The samurai and war general Saigo Takamori, who was a key figure in establishing the new Meiji government, grew disaffected with it upon seeing their efforts to get rid of the samurai class. In a last-ditch attempt to give the samurai any purpose in a modern society, he proposed invading and colonizing Korea to the Dajokan. He was overruled and in anger returned to his home in Satsuma. He then became a magnet for other angry samurai who were similarly disgusted with the new government's actions. When the government finally removed stipends for the samurai, it was the last straw for Saigo Takamori, who built an army to fight the government, igniting the Satsuma Rebellion. He led an army of samurai to attack Kumamoto Castle. This was the last stand for the old Japan against the new. Guarding the castle was the new modern military the government had drafted. Saigo referred to these conscripts as dirt farmers, because in the days of the shogunate, only the samurai were worthy enough to carry weapons. These dirt farmers were armed to the teeth and modern artillery. The army opened fire on Saigo's army with machine guns. The bullets ripped through the samurai's armor with ease. Saigo's army was no match for the modern artillery. Most of Saigo's men were either killed or committed suicide. What was left of his army was pushed back to Shiroyama in Satsuma, which would mark the end of his rebellion. His army was outnumbered 60-1, and in the final battle, he received a fatal bullet wound and committed ritual suicide. When the smoke finally cleared, it was apparent to all that the age of the samurai was over.